Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome to another interview segment hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Today, comrades Eddie, Noah, and myself will be chatting with JT Chapman of the Second Thought YouTube channel.
JT is a communist YouTuber based in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He's also one-third of the popular podcast The D Program, along with his co-hosts Hakeem and Ugopnik, which, along with having one of the best names I've ever heard for a podcast, covers all kinds of subjects from a Marxist perspective. He's been running the YouTube channel Second Thought for about 6 years, and after a hard left turn in 2020, he's been producing explicitly socialist content aimed at helping beginners understand socialism.
Yes, thanks
for coming on, brother.
Hey, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You bet. I've been a huge fan for a while. Kind of discovered your videos on stream, actually, and I was like, wow, this guy is incredibly based with incredibly high production value, and your subscriber count was growing, and our chat informed me that you are, in fact, very based and basically a Marxist. At the time, basically a Marxist. Now, I think you would say you are a Marxist explicitly, with over 1 million subscribers. So I feel like we have a lot to learn from you in terms of presentation and how you've been able to grow so much. So really looking forward to this. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got to the left? And from there, what was the transition towards being a communist like?
Yeah, sure. So I think my political journey, as cheesy as that sounds, it mirrors a lot of what Americans experienced. So for me, it kind of started back in 2016-ish with Bernie, his campaign, when he suddenly, he was saying all these things. Oh, wow, I've never heard that before. That kind of makes sense. Why don't we have, universal health care and all that stuff? Oh, other countries have that? That's cool. Why don't we have that? And that kind of started, going down the rabbit hole like it did for a lot of Americans, where, I learned that, oh, Bernie's not actually a socialist. He's a social democrat. Okay, what's the difference between social democracy and socialism? Things like that. And then I started doing some reading myself about, what socialism is really about. And then I read Lenin. I was like, okay, I get it now. This makes sense. This is for me. And then come 2020 with the botched coronavirus response, in the nation with the most resources to bring to bear to handle this pandemic, we just didn't do it. We just sacrificed 1 million Americans on the altar of capitalism. We had to make the line go up. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me. That's when I felt the need to pivot, to use my platform for something useful rather than, general interest sciencey stuff. I was like, all right, let's talk about socialism. Let's bring some other people on board. And that was pretty much it for me. But ever since then, it's been more or less going down the rabbit hole, reading as much as I can, watching other socialist creators. I've teamed up with Hakeem and Ugopnik to make a podcast, and it's all been very fun, very rewarding, much more so than what I was doing before.
That seems to be a general consensus. We used to talk about Bernie as a sort of Trojan horse, where like you have social democracy, and then inside you have hardcore Marxism, Leninism, and it's the path that I know Eddie and myself took, and a lot of the friends that we grew up with doing socialist activism, they ended up taking a similar path. By the way, I just wanted to say that the name, the deprogramming, the podcast, it's such a good name, because the word that Mao used to use for the similar phenomenon was brainwashing, but it doesn't have the same positive connotation as the deprogramming podcast. So,
well, thank you. Yeah, we were pretty pleased when we came up with that one, and that was a unanimous vote for sure. We like it.
I'm also a very big fan of puns, so the double meaning of that really hits me.
Yeah, glad you guys like it. Yeah, we're thrilled with the response we've gotten from the podcast so far. I mean, it was when we launched, it was like #1 on the educational charts for that week, over garbage like Jordan Peterson's podcast, and he has tremendous reach. So that was really a vote of confidence for us that okay, maybe people do want to listen to this sort of thing.
Absolutely. I find that it's, even with algorithmic suppression and a lack of real capital behind us, more and more people every year, and I've been at this a long time, especially in the last couple of years, even more than with Bernie, more and more and more people are just learning about Marxism, it's really inspiring.
Yeah, totally agree. And it's something that I wouldn't have expected even a few years ago, how much it's kind of taken off. And it's really heartening to see that. We just have to make sure that, we do continue to steer it in the right direction. It doesn't become co-opted like a lot of things have in recent years.
Absolutely. In connection to that, I wanted to jump into our second question. In our information age, there seems to be two extremes people fall into when making video content. One extreme focuses solely on the content of the video, making sure that what is being said is really good. This is usually done at the detriment or belittling of the video quality. I know this is something that we did for a while. The other extreme seems to focus on video presentation, ensuring that the video quality and editing is as good as possible. And this, again, is usually done to the detriment or belittling of the content quality. You seem to have had a really good pulse of the midpoint, making videos which are, in terms of content and presentation, really good. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of each aspect of the video creation process?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you that you think I've done a good job with it. That's nice to hear. I must be doing something right. But yeah, I think there are a lot of channels that go a little bit too much into the theater of video production to the detriment of the message. Those tend to be more liberal, more social democratic, not pushing for actual, revolutionary change, more kind of just polishing the terminus of capitalism. But for me, I knew I didn't want to go too dry with it, because that also that runs the risk of people not watching it. And that's the number one thing we need to do, is get eyes on our content. And in order to do that, it needs to be at least polished enough so that people won't click off. It also needs to have an air of professionalism, because we're going up against a tremendous propaganda apparatus. The right is incredibly well funded. They've got very nice graphics, entire departments working on things like PragerU. So their presentation's always very slick. And that's coming from a video production background. I knew that while I couldn't bring that kind of polish to bear myself, I could at least attempt to emulate that professionalism in my videos. And I think that goes a long way towards making people think, okay, maybe this guy is trustworthy, versus, me ranting in my car. That wouldn't have the same effect as a more put together presentation. But then also, if you stray too far towards the theatrical end, you run the risk of alienating a certain percentage of your viewership who are like, this is silly. What is this, theater kid nonsense? And, different strokes for different folks. But for me, I think finding the right balance between, extreme production, where you're spending a month, 2 months, 3 months working on a video, and then on the other end, just reading from a book, there needs to be a happy medium there. And I think people are starting to learn that and kind of hone in on what it is that works, what resonates with people on YouTube in 2023. I'm optimistic, I think.
That's very well said, JT. Thank you. I think it's a really good comment to sort of put on my theory nerd hat for a minute on the change in the economic base, creating changes within the superstructure, right? Like, people judge things at first glance always, but in our era, it's sort of hyper focused on a snap judgment of a sort of brand.
Yeah.
So being able to back up good content with a nice looking brand is incredibly effective, whether we want to say, we don't care about the brands, we hate capitalism anyway or not. Yeah. Right? You work with what you got. On the other hand, though, it also brings us into misconceptions, right? As long as someone says they're a socialist and, puts a picture of Marx that looks cool or whatever it is, people can believe that. So that actually leads me right into our next question. One of the things we see the most in our era are misconceptions about socialism. Are there any common ones that you get over and over we see a few basic ones and they seem to work in layers, right? First, there's socialism is when you force everyone to be equal, and then Stalin will eat everyone's babies and their babies' babies, so it's bad, right? And then once a person gets beyond that one, there's socialism is when you force everyone to be equal. Stalin was bad, but our good socialism hates Stalin anyways, so we'll force everyone to be equal without any baby eating whatsoever. So it's good. Do you see these misconceptions or maybe versions of them? Since I made up the whole baby eating thing, how do you respond to those?
Yeah, well, there are a ton. I get tens of thousands of views on each video, and that means I get thousands of comments, and not all of them are good. One of the more common ones I see actually comes from well-intentioned people. I think you have, the bad faith actors who will come in and say, "Oh, you know what? Well, socialism is just communism, and you know what communism does." And then, someone will chime in and say, "Oh, well, socialism isn't actually the same thing as communism. We want socialism. We don't want to, go all the way to communism." And I see that, I'm like, that's just a lack of understanding of you haven't done the reading there. Communism is the end goal, which is what I tell those people in the comments generally, as gently as I can. Like, you don't need to be afraid of the word communism. Look at the past socialist experiments. Look at what the goals of communism actually are. You've got this, for most of us here in the West, this Red Scare rhetoric baked into your psyche, where you hear the word communism and you get this knee-jerk, fear or fight or flight response. And so you feel like you need to distance the word socialism, which is what, is palatable to advocate for here in the United States, from the word communism, which is evil, totalitarian, whatever. So that's one that I see a lot, and I try to gently correct that as best I can, but that it does take some reading and it takes time to deprogram yourself from that belief. But another one that I see a lot is that socialist projects always fail. And this one is fairly easy to debunk if you want to take the time to do it. It's like, all right, these socialist projects always fail, and the United States says, oh, they're always going to collapse. Why is it that they're never left on their own to collapse? If they're going to collapse anyway, why spend the tremendous amount of money and time and resources and lives to force them to collapse? It seems like a waste of effort. And so if you point out to people that every single time there's been a socialist project, every single time, not most of the time, there has been meddling from the imperialist powers. There has been undermining, there have been coups, there have been invasions, there have been blockades every single time. And when you point that out to people, one easy way to do it, to get through to the right wing, for me, is to just give them a book on the CIA, the crimes of the CIA. And that'll generally say, oh, okay, well, why aren't they left alone to fail? And that, to me, is often a good starting point, a good foot in the door to have that conversation about whether socialist projects are destined to fail or whether there's something else going on there. And then the last one that I'll mention, because there are so many, is that socialist projects always become authoritarian. And this one drives me up the wall because it hinges on a definition of authoritarianism that does not apply or is never used to define something like the United States, which I think by definition is the most authoritarian regime in the modern world. I mean, we've got the most incarcerated people, both per capita and by sheer numbers, far more than somewhere like the Soviet Union ever had, which is what people think of when they think of, a carceral state. We have an exploitative relationship, a coercive relationship with labor. We are supposedly have the right to refuse to work. We have the freedom to choose not to go to work any given day of the week. But if we do that, we're essentially choosing to starve. We'll be fired. The economics behind it is not sound. So for me, I think people really need to, what I typically do is I recommend, please read, On Authority by Engels. Real quick, very easy. It's a nice starter. And when you start to think about what authoritarianism actually looks like, the United States is going to check every single box. And so that's another conversation that can often be productive, but you have to start from a common understanding of what authoritarianism looks like.
Yeah, that's a great great answer. For me, it was, I mean, the sort of path to communism or Marxism Leninism was studying Venezuela. I got in a debate with my right-wing economics professor, who told me socialism failed in Venezuela, destroyed the country, and I was like, well, what is the purpose of the U.S. sanctions then? If it's gonna fail regardless, then why do we need to put hundreds of sanctions on this country and do all these coup efforts? And then I ended up writing my senior thesis on Venezuela. Then I was, that motivated by that debate I had with my professor. And, what I found was that the authoritarianism of the Venezuelan government was generally a response to U.S. coup efforts or U.S. sanction regimes. It was like the more, and the Venezuelan government wasn't even that authoritarian. Like if someone like Juan Guaido was walking around in the U.S. claiming to be president, he would be arrested for treason in seconds. Yet this person's allowed to walk free in Venezuela. It made no sense. And then you learn about some of the gains of socialism in Venezuela, the fact that it, provided education for their people, provided healthcare for their people, and, all these great things that are being sabotaged by U.S. sanctions. It's like, who's the authoritarian one here? Is it the foreign country sabotaging another country, a poorer country, doing everything they can to prevent their people from having access to medicine and food and the things they need? Or is it the country trying to bring their people medicine and food and trying to really bring the workers to power? And I totally agree with On Authority. That's one of the greatest short little texts that anybody could read.
One of the things I find really interesting about the authoritarianism thing is that it usually comes from folks who, everyone at their core is well-meaning, but they're talking about a thing they don't really understand, right? If they say, communist China is authoritarian, I ask if they know how their legislature is set up, right? How does the actual democratic process work in China? And I've never met a single person that actually even knew what the National People's Congress was, right? And it's or what neighborhood committees are. And so when you start to explain the actual process, that goes a long way in combating that one as well, I think.
I think that one of the most impressive things about your channel and the way you think, and especially in comparison to the size, is that those three misconceptions which you said are the most frequent and that you most frequently debunk, they're basically held by the vast majority of American socialists. And that's one of the saddest things. They agree, they buy into the propaganda that that socialist countries of the past, or that every country that's been headed by a communist party has been authoritarian. They buy into the idea that it's always failed, and they themselves participate in the sort of rejection of the label of communist for a more comfortable socialist or democratic socialist label, which produces the idea that there have been socialisms which have not been democratic. And I think that's a flawed idea. But in our project, we've been theorizing this as a purity fetish. They have this pure idea of what communism should look like, which is communism as what Marx described as the highest stage of communism, something that's very much intended to be thought of in the distant future. And if Chinese socialism doesn't look, in the words of Samir Amin, as the socialism of the 23rd century, it's rejected. And if countries like Venezuela or Cuba or China, or in its time the USSR, had to take stricter measures in order to protect its sovereignty against imperialist forces that are working both within and outside of the country, then that's authoritarianism. And it's I think rooted in a complete absence of dialectical thinking, because even the word itself, authoritarianism, it's like there's a very big difference between a working class state being authoritarian against forces that are trying to overthrow it, and a capitalist state being authoritarian in order to sustain an existing order which exploits and oppresses the vast majority of people. So I'm always reminded here of a quote from Maximilien Robespierre that he said 3 months before he got his head chopped off. But he makes reference to the sword when they ask him about violence. He's like, is the sword of the freedom fighter someone fighting for the emancipation of the people, yeah, sure, it glimmers in the sun in a similar way as those that are fighting to preserve the crown and to preserve the oppression of the people. But you would have to be a fool to say that they're the same thing because of that. And I treat the question of totalitarianism or authoritarianism in a similar manner. Like, who is benefiting from this authority of the state being used? And in socialist states, it's the vast majority of people, whereas in capitalism, it's a small group of people who own basically everything and who continue to somehow convince other people that that socialist states are authoritarian, and convince even those who claim to adhere to the same ideas as the socialist states.
Yeah, well said. And I think it's the fact that so many people are kind of squeamish and use that word authoritarian a lot. I think it's rooted in a form of idealism where, you know, you're okay with this
Right.
rosy ideal of revolution as long as you don't have to think about the particulars. You don't have to, you know, at the end of the day, you got to defend your revolution. What does that look like? And that's what you have to grapple with, to understand that this is not an easy process. Like there are measures that need to be taken to make sure that the project that we all believe is just and correct will be allowed to continue, because there are so many forces, both within and without, that would love to see it fail. And that's something that I think a lot of more liberal-minded socialists tend to miss.
I think
You
you really hit the nail on the head with idealism, right? They're holding up what should be against an idealized version of something coming straight out of their heads. In the real world, we're responding to real world actions. If there is a certain measure of authority taken, that's everywhere, across every revolution, no matter what class is waging it, right? The Sons of Liberty here in our bourgeois revolution were tarring and feathering Tories.
Yeah.
People suspected of helping the British were murdered in their sleep. I mean, it's not pretty, no matter what class it is. When it's in the name of the people and it's defensive violence, though, in protecting what we have, I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, it's it's folks who lay the schism between the ideal and reality, and then for them, reality always ends up losing. And to keep the purity of the ideal, they just continue to say the phrase that I'm sure we've all heard, which is, "It's not actually socialism." You know, this is not actually socialism, right? Noah often jokes that he wants to write a book about all the not actually socialisms. But I want to transition into our next question. In your recent video, "Why You Should Be a Socialist in 2023," which is a wonderful title, you reference the American socialist Eugene Debs in saying that, quote, "Socialism is merely an extension of the ideal of democracy into the economic field," end quote. One of the things we constantly emphasize at our institute is the importance of working from the American people's common sense to re-articulate, as Gramsci would say, the rational kernels that exist within their fragmentary and incoherent worldviews towards socialism. I think you do a tremendously good job at speaking about socialism in a manner which connects to the American people's common sense and feelings. Is this something that you do intentionally, or is it an organic development based on the fact that you yourself have developed as a socialist within the concrete conditions of the U.S.?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a little bit of both. Like anyone, I'm shaped by my material conditions and the environment that I grew up in, and that affects how I communicate with people. But part of it is definitely intentional. You can throw books at people all day. You can cite all these academic studies or whatever, but that's rarely what gets your foot in the door with these important conversations. I've found it's much more effective just to talk to people, to extend a hand, to commiserate. And we're all facing the same problems. And my goal is to explain that in a way that's accessible, but that also doesn't feel condescending. So it's something that it's an approach that I've cultivated over the last few years. Because I'm guilty of being snarky sometimes. I'm guilty of talking down to people when I think that their perspective is foolish. And that, while it can be cathartic, is not generally the best approach. I think it's far better to meet people where they are, to try to explain things in a way that resonates with the American experience, and I do get complaints about this from people from other parts of the world, which I understand. But at the end of the day, I'm an American. It's what I know best. Most of my audience is in the United States, and so that's kind of who I cater my rhetoric towards.
I love how you mentioned the fact that you make it something very explicit, not to have people feel like you're talking to them in a condescending manner, because those are often relationships that are replicated on the left, unfortunately, because the professional managerial class, or what used to be called petty bourgeois radicals, have been in our economy the folks who have had the most time to do socialist organizing. A lot of organizations, their class composition is primarily from these sectors, and it's not a problem to have professional managerial class people organize for socialism, but it creates a certain culture which has been shaped by what us and some of our comrades have been calling the iron triangle of academia, the media, and NGOs. And these sorts of institutions develop a culture which sometimes makes working people feel as if they're being talked to in a very condescending and HR manner to when they engage with socialist organizations. And this is something that the folks at our institute, like Noah, who are, what Gramsci would call organic intellectuals, this is something that they can sort of verify in their personal experience. So it's nice that you make it an intentional effort to not have something like that come out in your videos.
Yeah, I often tell stories about being embarrassed to bring my coworkers to meetings, right? Because there's just a culture there that's not what we're used to. But one thing I really wanted to ask you on this topic, do you have any sort of tips for how you talk to just regular people, coworkers, family, people out in the world, just to sort of get your foot in the door? For example, I have like a thing I do every cash register I ever go to, right? They go, "Hey, how you doing?" I go, "Tired as hell. How about you?" Right? And they go, "Oh, I know what you mean. Same." I go, "Well, of course you do. That's what happens when they got you spending 8 hours a day making somebody else rich," right? And everybody gets that. You're not talking down to them. You're bringing them in, and you're bringing you and them onto the same team with the same enemy, the boss.
Yeah, I think it depends on who I'm talking to and what their background is. My approach with an Ivy League liberal will be different from one of my coworkers. I used to work at Best Buy, and I try my best, like I said, to meet people where they are, use language that is appropriate for either the position they're working in, or their material circumstances, or their level of education. So it is kind of like code switching to an extent. And you kind of get a feel for it over time as to what will make people comfortable. And you're not trying to trick them or anything, but you also don't want them to feel like they're stupid, or that you think their worldview is inherently wrong in every way. There are always things that we have in common. So I find that it's very useful to at least acknowledge one of those things. So say, hey, we agree on this thing. We may not agree entirely on the solutions, but we can talk about, what we have in common. We can talk about this problem that we both agree is a problem. And I'd love to hear what you think about it. And if you'd like to hear, I can give you some thoughts that I have on the subject. And so it's not like you're forcing anything down their throat. It's like, hey, I'm here if you want to chat about this. I think I've got some interesting ideas. And that generally, to me, has worked pretty well. We some friends and I, we do this thing, or we did before COVID. We called them lit talks, where we would get together once a year. Everyone would do a presentation on something that they're passionate about. You make it really terrible, like PowerPoint presentation. Everybody gets drunk and you talk about what you're passionate about. And so the first time I went, obviously I did mine on socialism, and none of the people in the room were socialists. I live in Texas, so obviously a lot of conservatives, a lot of libertarians. One dude who identifies as a future communist, he says, "Oh, communism sounds great in theory, but we'll get there, 6 centuries from now." And so I took that opportunity to do my best to lay out a case for socialism that resonated with the people who live in my community in Texas, in Dallas-Fort Worth area. So I talked about, the local businesses that were struggling against Amazon, things like that. And when you couch your language in the concrete lived reality of the person you're talking to, it resonates much more than if you cite statistics or reference a dusty old tome or even a modern book that maybe is written by someone who's not from your community. So connecting to people on a personal or community level is, I think, the best possible way to get a productive conversation going.
100%. In the internet age, it's often really hard to make the sort of transfer that's a lot easier in real life than on the internet. One of the things we talk about a lot at the Midwestern Marx Institute is sort of the seeming generational gap in understanding the importance of technology, computers, and the internet, which I mean, are just phenomenal at doing, right? I mean, it's deeper than just needing to set up phones and stuff like that for our parents, right? There's a sort of thing in there. For us, we see computers and the internet in particular as on par with, if not even more important than the invention of the steam engine and assembly line in how production is carried out, laying the material basis for a genuinely new mode of production. This, of course, carries with it the necessity of having to re-ask a lot of the basic questions we thought resolved within Marxism. Would you agree with something like this? And if you do, what questions do you think require new answers?
Yeah, absolutely. God bless the trots, but there's a reason I'm making YouTube videos and not handing out newspapers, rehashing issues that have been resolved, 100 years ago. I made a video for CPUSA's international conference a while back where I talked about the importance of the internet as a front in the war for the hearts and minds of people around the world. I think the left does a particularly bad job of making use of the resources at our disposal. Socialist organizations are particularly guilty of this. Like, you go to a meeting and it's like nobody has ever heard of the internet. We're stuck in these 20th century notions of organizing, which, that's not to rag on more traditional methods of organizing, but you're leaving a lot on the table if you're not taking advantage of TikTok and YouTube and Twitter and Twitch, even things like Substack or a dedicated website to post your multimedia stuff. Whereas the right does take advantage of the internet tremendously well. And part of that is because they have an enormous amount of funding. You got countless websites, you got YouTube channels, you got podcasts, you got radio shows, streaming. And then you've got stuff like PragerU, which has managed to make right-wing content online appealing to an older audience that is barely computer literate. And they still get, they manage to bring those people online specifically to watch their content. And it shows just how well they've taken advantage of this medium and how much work the left has to do, because there is no left-wing answer to PragerU. I mean, you could say the Gravel Institute, to an extent, that's what they're trying to do. I mean, you can argue how well that's going. As for questions that need answering, I think how best organizations can take advantage of something like YouTube or online content creation while maintaining democratic control of that content creation, because it does kind of tend to be a one person or a few people kind of project when you're producing videos. Another one is how best to counter the prevalence of right-wing online media. So, for example, do we spend our time and energy trying to debunk their nonsense, because it takes exponentially more time to debunk their lies than it takes for them to spew them, so we're always on the back foot there? Or do we spend our time just promoting our vision of the future and of a better society? Those are tough questions, and I think both are valuable, but we need to spend some more time really thinking about that. Another one is, how do we fund the online left, or how do we produce content that can go toe-to-toe with the right, the online right, without the funding or with a smaller budget. And that's something that I'm constantly trying to work on. Like, how can I maximize my production value when I don't have the backing of the oil lobby or something like that? And it's a challenge. It's really hard to do. It's easier to do these days. The democratization of video production has been a tremendous benefit to the left. I mean, like, that camera back there is like, I don't know, $2,000, something like that, which is not nothing, but that'll shoot 6K video. You could shoot a documentary with that thing. It's the average person within reason could save up for the equipment to do what I do. It's not, you don't even need that much. Your phone shoots 4K video. If you light yourself well, most people aren't going to be able to tell it's a phone. So there are ways to deal with that, but that is on the broader side of things, that is a question that we need to address, the funding gap. One thing that I think is important to mention is that people say the internet isn't real life, but it does affect real life. You know, most of the interactions we have these days are online with people we've never met and likely will never meet in person. I mean, fascism has seen such a tremendous resurgence recently, specifically because these people have been able to find a home online that previously they probably wouldn't have been able to. You know, you had underground fascist movements since the interwar period, but they've been small and fragmented and difficult to organize. But now, super easy. You can find that stuff immediately with a quick Google search online. The left doesn't really have an answer to that. So a question is why? Why can't we just build something similar to that, where you've got a pipeline, if you want to call it that, where, and I like to see myself as kind of the mouth of that funnel, where you get these normies at the very mouth of the funnel and then slowly bring them down to more radical content where they learn, okay, this is what the left-wing economic theory actually looks like on a granular level. It's the dry stuff, because they're not going to go to it right away. They need to be eased into it. So we need to really recognize that if the left can't do what the right is doing, if we can't offer people a home online, the far right is extending that hand to the alienated masses. If we can't do that, if we have nothing to offer people, we're going to lose. So that's a big thing we need to address.
You're absolutely right, because we're entering a very deep moment of crisis. You know, not just objective crisis in the traditional sense of economic crisis, but also a crisis that it's a comprehensive crisis. It's affecting people's mental health. It's a crisis of legitimacy politically. It's a very deep crisis, and we know that fascism comes about in these moments of crisis. And the same soil which creates fertile conditions for socialist revolutions also creates fertile conditions for fascist reactions, and we have to be there to meet that. One of the things that I wanted to mention that I think you hit the nail on the head with is, you know, if we are able to organize everyone online, we're not going to have a revolution. But we also, in the same way that we can't overestimate it, we cannot underestimate it. I think it's the internet has emerged as one of the most important ideological terrains where we have to wage, you know, a war of positions, a war of ideas, and I think the last time I checked, the average American spends 7 to 8 hours a day on their phone, and it's usually mostly on social media. So it's so incredibly important that we are able to adjust to the age, because as you mentioned, the right and, you know, also the neoliberal right is adjusting to that in part because of the funding gap, which you have mentioned.
Yeah, Carlos, you almost stole the words out of my mouth there. I was going to say no, that's all right. That's right. One of the things that Carlos is always saying is that the internet and social media have brought about basically a new field, a new battleground for ideological struggle between socialist and reactionary ideas. So our next question then is, how do you see agitation and ideological struggle changing in the internet age? As you sort of mentioned with your point about Trots handing out irrelevant newspapers, the old party spokesman standing on the soapbox in the town square model is not playing the same role that it once did. You know, some people have said that Twitter and the internet have become sort of the town square where people can come and discuss ideas. So what do you see as the primary modes of agitation in this era? And how can we connect this to building the concrete institutions necessary to create real change, those concrete institutions in real life? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with the Twitter thing. We have to look, for better or for worse, we have to look at corporate platforms as the town square now. As much as it sucks that there's no public alternative to YouTube, that's where the eyeballs are. That's just the way it is. We all have access to our own personal soapbox in the form of online accounts, whether you want to shitpost on Twitter or drop like a 3-hour Marxist analysis of Ratatouille. You've got options. We can all do this. You need to get involved. That's the thing. I think a critical component of modern agitation is using the online platforms as a funnel to real life organizations. One of the most common questions I get asked is, okay, this all sounds great, but what can I do? What can we do? I mean, this seems hopeless. I'm like, the answer is always the same. And I mention it at the end of my videos a lot. Of course, most people don't have the attention span, but if, say, 1/100th of my audience would join an organization, that's 15,000 new members. If 1 in 10 joined when I suggested that they do so, that's 150,000 new members. At its peak in the 1940s, CPUSA had 75,000 members. So we have the reach. If I could convert my audience like that, that's twice the peak that the largest communist organization in the United States has had. So it's not just me. We've got so many great leftist content creators to help funnel people into real life organizing. And people will say, oh, these organizations, they're revisionist, whatever. Go to DSA for all I care. Like, start there, learn the ropes of organizing in your community. And then there are some radical branches even of DSA. So that's great. But or start your hyper-specific splinter party if you want to. But just do something in real life, get involved. And that's what I always suggest at the end of my videos. It's like, please follow the links in the description. This is a concrete, easy step you can take to learn how you can get involved. So we just need to be able to convert on these views that we do get. But another important factor is dragging these organizations into the 21st century, because, like I said before, they are kind of stuck in a 20th century form of organizing. What we need is a department for online media. You need a YouTube cadre. You need a dude or a group of people who are really good at thumbnails or who are really good at gaming SEO. There are these critical aspects of existing in the 21st century that we're just leaving on the table at the organizational level. There are people doing it individually who are members of organizations, but when you go to the CPUSA or PSL YouTube channel, you're like, man, this needs some work. This really could use some polishing. And like, I'm not great with thumbnails. I've started to get better with it. I finally found a style recently, but like, come on, you need to get people to click on your videos. If people don't know that your party exists because you're that bad at using the internet, that is a failing on our part. If we cannot get the word out that we're out here, that we have organizations, that if you feel alienated and left behind, you can come and work with us to build a better future, what are we doing? We are missing the point of what socialist agitation is about. So this is something I think we really need to focus on, because I think a lot of people on the left, in the United States particularly, focus on, promoting this ideology that they probably genuinely believe in, but never make the connection to say, all right, mass movement time. Let's get involved. Here's how. You make a great, half-hour video, and then people are like, wow, yeah, that's great. Capitalism's bad. They click off, they do nothing. That is a failing. That is a person we have failed a click we've failed to convert. It's a loss. So I think when you get right down to it, the internet is a tremendously useful tool, but it's just that. It's not a solution in and of itself. It is a tool that should be used to funnel people into real life organizations. And once we understand that a little bit better, I think we'll be in a better position to counter the right.
Well, so well said, brother. I think the one thing I always hear why people aren't in the Communist Party or whatever is in their location, they go, oh, but they have the wrong stance on X, Y, or Z, right? So they just stand on the sidelines sort of complaining about it. Look, if you think you can do better, help us do better, right? People, if you approach people kindly and say, check out what I got going on, I think you guys would really benefit from this. How can I get involved? People will listen.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
change doesn't happen overnight. We're coming out of the deepest retreat the genuine progressive forces of America have ever been in history. And we're just taking our first few sort of stumbling steps out of the dark. Marxism's back, though. Be a part of what creates change here, you know, rather than just complaining about us not doing what you think is perfect. Also, side note, my son literally gave me a Marxist analysis on Ratatouille once. I swear
No
to
way.
God. I was going crazy when you said that.
That's amazing.
He was like 11 years old and talking about the exploitation of Remy, and yeah, it was.
Yes, next head of Marxism right there.
I think it's so important. If we look back at the most successful socialist revolutions that we've had, what's made them, what's given them world historical significance has in part been its creative aspect, its ability to bring forth this living tradition and to use it to analyze our world today and to realize, what sort of practices were accepted in the past and we have to adjust today. What sort of new practice do we have to bring forth? The structure of like communist parties, they're modeled after Lenin's idea for a party of a new type. And that sort of thing, I think, needs to be done at a time when we have this information age that has just drastically changed human life, in ways that I don't think we've ever really seen in the history of humanity. So we need to reassess how we can have within the party of a new type. I don't know, but we need to carry Marxism Marxism-Leninism, at least for us specifically, as a living spirit that we need to bring into our age. And it takes creative actions. We can't, dogmatically hold on to how things were in the past. That kills the spirit of Marxism. Marxism is not a series of dogmas and conclusions. It is a worldview that we consistently use to understand the world as best as possible and to understand how to change that world. And that requires new solutions for new eras.
A party of a brand new type.
Brand new type. You have to, yeah. And within the brand new, instead of just typing it out, you have to do that little thing that stores do, where it's like a red circle with the little X's.
Yeah, perfect. We've solved it.
Yeah. That's all we need. Yeah, we just need the little red thing and we're set to go. But
honestly, I think in our era, and I hope we are a small part of this, the creation of genuine American Marxism is beginning. And that's really, really exciting. And that's going to require, or not require, it's going to create new forms of organization. It's going to create new tactics, new strategies, everything. Being stuck in the past, it has always been something of a problem for the left. We scramble to play catch up rather than, creating a party of a brand new type. I say that jokingly, but it's a very serious idea.
Yeah, and I mean, when I found your channel, Second Thought, JT, to your credit, it blew me away. Like the production value, and I was watching, I'm like, this guy's pretty based. And the chat was like, yeah, he's basically a Marxist-Leninist. I'm like, what? Like, he has over 1 million subscribers. And, it's incredible. So I think that you're on the cutting edge of what we need to be doing in the internet age. And I think there's a lot that we can all learn from you. And yeah, I think it shows that I think both of our channels, our institutes, are products of the material conditions that we live in. People recognize capitalism's decaying. They're looking for a way out. And now, there are people with you who have these video production skills, who are putting, putting your efforts and energy towards ideological struggle and organizing. So, we're only going to see more of that with time. And yeah.
By the way, Eddie brought your channel to all of us at the Institute too, like right away. It was like, you got to check this out. He's a tanky. It was, and it is great.
Well,
I particularly really liked the how to make communist propaganda video.
That was fun. I enjoyed making that one. That was kind of a departure from what I usually do. But I'm like, hey, people have asked me this before. What the heck? I can give them a little primer. Maybe some more people will start doing this. More agitation is always a good thing.
It's a very audacious title too, I gotta say. We will be taking some of those tips. I just watched it yesterday, and I wrote some stuff down to see how we can improve our production value. I really appreciate an idea that you brought up earlier in the discussion, which is the need to adjust to the concrete communities. And you adjusted the discourse that the event that you said that your friends asked you to do a presentation on something you're passionate about. You adjusted it to the community that you were a part of. And this requires, one, knowing the community, and then how to translate these ideas into a way that people accept. And I think if there's something that is going to be taken away from this podcast is that idea, which I think it's a more general way of encapsulating both the question of technology and how do we use it for communist agitation and propaganda, but also a question that needs to be posed in the U.S. because we have very easy pathways of deviations towards like very far left, what Lenin would call ultra left positions, and also pathways towards right, what we used to call right opportunist positions. And it's very easy to develop a sense of national and historical nihilism, to just hate everything about the past. And I think that's a mistake. You need to connect with the people in your country, because at the end of the day, the task of building socialism is a project that is going to massively increase the living standards and the well-being of the people in your country. And if you don't know them, one, if you don't have some sense of love for them in the Che Guevara sense of the word, you're not going to succeed. You can't have this condescending attitude towards them. And America is a very big country. So doing that task that you mentioned requires knowing the country in different regions. You can't like apply what works like in New York to Iowa. And that's something that as someone who has personally gone around the country doing organizing work, I know that like the way that I speak to working class people in Dubuque, Iowa cannot be the same to the same way that I use in Miami, or the same way that I use in Carbondale when I'm teaching. So it's you need to adjust your tactics to the context. So I think that's something very important that people should be remembering. No copy and pasting of methods or solutions to different contexts.
Yeah.
As Stalin says, everything depends on the conditions, time, and place. That's my favorite quote of all time, by the way.
Well, brother, it's been a very insightful discussion, interview. Is there anything you would like to plug before we go?
Well, if you haven't seen my channel, I do Second Thought, and I check out the deprogram if you're interested in some longer form stuff. It's a lot of shit posting. It's a lot of I wouldn't listen to it with your mother in the car, but it's a good time. It's a
you don't know my mom.
Yeah, based mom, but it's a good way to decompress. If you're feeling a little doomery, listen to deprogram, have a good time, relax a little bit. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Second Thought and deprogram.
Awesome. We love it. Revolutionary optimism,
Amen. Well,
all right, brother. Guys. Thanks again for coming on. And thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.